Hello and welcome to the channel. Well, the time has arrived, you guys. It is time for me to do a discography ranking for this band. Now, this is one of those rankings that are very difficult for me, considering that I consider them one of my favorite bands of all time. You already know what the band is. The band is Iron Maiden, and we'll be ranking the discography. We'll be ranking them, of course, from worst to best. Now, this ranking could maybe change in the near future. I don't know. That's part of the reasons why I've always, kind of been hesitant about doing a ranking video like this for this band, since, either because my ranking has kind of changed, but not too much. Either because of that or the controversy that my list might have, because I can definitely see some Iron Maiden fans being a little stirred up about my ranking a little bit, since I do have a few unpopular opinions when it comes to Iron Maiden. But whatever. Let's go ahead and get into the ranking, and we're going to start off what of course I think is the weakest of Maiden's material. So at the bottom we got Virtual 11. Now this is the second and last album to feature Blaze on vocals. Yeah, definitely their weakest album, in my opinion. Now, I can't sit here and say that this album is just a terrible album, but I do think it is their weakest. And it's got one of the worst Iron Maiden songs, if not probably the worst Iron Maiden song, which is The Angel and the Gambler. The song isn't like just a trash fest or anything, it's just very repetitive. There's certain lines in the song that are repeated a little too many times. And yeah, it's just a very repetitive song. But this album definitely has some songs that I do like on it, especially Future Real and The Klansman. I think that these are actually some of the best songs that Blaze did with Iron Maiden. These are actually some really good Iron Maiden tracks. But yeah, Virtual 11, I do think it is their weakest. But I can't say that it's just a terrible album. So yeah, Virtual 11. Okay, so next up here we got The Final Frontier. Now I know there's going to be some people that disagree with this album being as low as it is on my ranking. I just feel like for me personally, this album just doesn't really do much for me. This album's biggest problem is it just lacks replay value. A lot of the songs just feel like they don't go anywhere musically, except for the song When the Wild Wind Blows, which I think is actually a really good song. Definitely one of my favorites, along with Coming Home, which is probably my favorite song on the entire album. But yeah, this album is just a little boring for me. This album I just feel like drags on for way too long. Definitely feels uninspired, It's just, I don't know, this album just has a lot of forgettable tracks on it. But once again, like I said about Virtual 11, this album I don't think is bad. I just think it's a decent album at best. So, yeah, The Final Frontier. So next up we got A Matter of Life and Death. Now, believe it or not, there was actually a point where I had this album a lot higher in my ranking. But I don't know, nowadays it just doesn't really do much for me. This is definitely one of Maiden's most, I guess, boring albums. Kind of a similar complaint I have with The Final Frontier. This album just doesn't really do much for me as well. But I can't say that it's, again, a bad album. I think it's decent. Different World is probably my favorite song on the entire album. I actually really dig this song. So, yeah. Like I said, the album is a little boring, but I can appreciate the, I guess, dark mood that the album was trying to deliver. So it is kind of unique, but it is one of their weakest, I think. So yeah, A Matter of Life and Death, definitely not one of their best, but it's okay, I'd say. Now next up, some people might, get triggered for my placing of this album. Next up we got No Prayer for the Dying. Now, I know there's a lot of people that do have this album at the bottom, or at least at the second weakest behind Virtual 11. But for me personally, this album isn't all bad. I understand that there might be some people that might get upset that I have this album above The Final Frontier and A Matter of Life and Death, but this album just has better replay value for me than those albums. Now, that's not to say that this album has, the best replay value in the world or anything, but the replay value is at least a little bit better. I'd say a pinch better. But yeah, I do like songs like Tail Gunner and Run Silent, Run Deep. I think these are actually some pretty good tracks, but yeah. Not one of their best, but I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. So yeah, No Prayer for the Dying. I think it's a decent album, even though it's not one of their best still. Now, next up, I know there's some people that will definitely disagree with my placing of this album, because I know there's some people that have this album somewhere in the top 5, which I'll never understand why. I'll never understand the hype with this album. And you guys already know what it is. It is Iron Maiden's latest album, The Book of Souls. And I know what you're thinking. How is this album not higher? Like, this is one of the best albums that they ever came out with. This is the best thing that Iron Maiden came out with since their 1980s material. How is this album not higher, But personally, I think this album is just a little overrated, and it's a pretty overhyped album, I'd say. This album gets way more praise than I think it should. And mainly just due to, I guess, the memorable tracks that are on the album. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that this is a good album, and from this point on in the ranking, we're getting into some really good stuff by Iron Maiden, but this album for me, I don't know, it's too overrated, it's too overhyped, but even without that, the songs themselves are good. I still think the musicianship on this album is, well, it's technically great, but the memorable songs just aren't there. But still, this album definitely has some songs that I do like. I like Speed of Light and the title track, which I think is one of the best Iron Maiden songs of their modern time. And I do like Shadows of the Valley too. That's a good song too. But yeah, The Book of Souls, I think it's a good album, even though I don't think it's one of their best. I know that's a rather unpopular opinion, but whatever. Okay, so next up, now some people might disagree with this album being above The Book of Souls, A Matter of Life and Death, and The Final Frontier, but whatever. I do think this album is actually pretty underrated, and that is the album Dance of Death. Now, there's a lot of people that actually have this album at the bottom when it comes to Iron Maiden's modern time. I never understood why, because I like this album. It's actually underrated. I don't think it's one of their best by any means, but I think it's a good album. I like songs like Rainmaker, No More Lies, Passchendaele, and Journeyman. I think those are really good songs, and this album definitely has some underrated stuff on it too. But yeah, I do like the album. If you haven't listened to it in a while, definitely go back and revisit it. Yeah, I think it's actually a really good album. Not one of their best, of course, but I do like it. So, Dance of Death. Alright, so, next up, now I know there's some people that might disagree with this album, where it is. I know some people might disagree with my placing for this album. But here goes nothing. Next up, we got Killers, which is the second album by Iron Maiden and the last album with Paul on vocals. Now, out of the two albums with Paul on vocals, this is definitely the one that this is probably my least favorite of the two, but that's not saying much, because I think it's still a really good album. Now, I'm not sure how to describe my complaint with this album, but it's a little too, upbeat. I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it, but it just doesn't really sound like Maiden as far as, the other stuff goes, But that's not to say that there's no good songs on here. I still think this is actually a really good album. I like songs like Wrathchild, of course. It's a classic. How do you not like it? And then Another Life and the title track are also really good. But yeah, Killers, You could argue that this album is also kind of overrated too, but I don't know. This is one of those albums that I don't see the hype behind, but I definitely do like the album though. I still think it's a really good album. Don't get me wrong. So, Killers. So next up, we got the self-titled debut, Iron Maiden. Now, like I said, out of the two albums with Paul, Killers is probably my least favorite, so I do prefer the debut album over Killers. I know that's a rather unpopular opinion, and I think the reason that a lot of people prefer Killers is because the debut album is a little more, I guess, classic rock influenced, you know, since this is like in the early days of not just Iron Maiden, but in the early days of heavy metal too. So, of course, you know, they're going to take some of that classic rock influence. But of course, you know, I do like classic rock, so that doesn't bother me much. This album definitely has some good songs on it. I just think it has better songs than Killers overall. I like Remember Tomorrow, Running Free, Phantom of the Opera, and of course the title track, Iron Maiden. I mean, these are some great songs, but yeah. The debut album, Iron Maiden, I think it's a great album for sure. You can even argue that this album is a little underrated. Definitely when it comes to Maiden's 80s material, I would say that this album is underrated. Obviously, it's not the most underrated album in the world, but I feel like when it comes to their 1980s stuff, you could make that argument. So, yeah, the debut album. Okay, so next up, oh boy, some people might disagree with this one too. I know there's some people that might disagree with this album being above Killers, the self-titled album, The Book of Souls, etc. But yeah, next up, we got the first album with Blaze on vocals before, you know, whenever Bruce had his little departure from Iron Maiden. Next up, we got the X Factor. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this album to me is super underrated. I mean, this album definitely doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. This album, I think, is fantastic. I mean, there's not really much wrong with the album. Now, I will admit, at my first listen, I was a little iffy about the album, you know, because, you know, it's a different vocalist. I'm not sure about this, you know, sound that they're going for with this album. But this is definitely one of Maiden's darkest sounding albums, and I do like it. I think it went off really well. I like songs like Sign of the Cross, Lord of the Flies, Man on the Edge, Judgment of Heaven, and The Unbeliever. These are some really good songs. Definitely an underrated album. I might even go as far to say that this is one of maybe even the most underrated Iron Maiden album, but I don't know. Really difficult to decide, but yeah. I do like this album. So, The X Factor, I think it's a great album. Definitely underrated. Okay, so next up, some people might disagree with this one being maybe where it is on my ranking too, but who knows. There's some people that I know that would have this album towards the bottom, but I don't know. But either way, next up, we got Fear of the Dark. Now, this was the last album with Iron Maiden with Bruce before his little departure whenever he went to go pursue a solo career. I do like this album. I think this is also another one of Iron Maiden's most underrated albums. I like songs like Be Quicker, Be Dead, From Here to Eternity, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, and of course the title track. I mean, this is one of those songs you just can't go wrong with, but the whole album as a whole is actually really good. This one also has a dark vibe to it, but I do like this album, though. It's actually a really great album. So, yeah, Fear of the Dark. Alright, now, next up, some people might disagree with this album being this high up on my ranking, but I don't know. This album, I just really dig this album. I mean, it's definitely, in my opinion, the best of Iron Maiden's modern time. You guys already know what it is. It is the comeback album with Bruce on vocals, and that is Brave New World, and I mean, this album is just great. I mean, a lot of great songs on it, like Ghosts of the Navigator, the title track, And this album also has some underrated stuff on it, like The Mercenary and Fallen Angel. These are some really great songs, but yeah, Brave New World is definitely a fantastic album. I mean, there's a lot of people that would agree that this is the best of Maiden's modern work. I mean, I definitely think it is. I think this album it's really great. Not much to say about it. You just, have to listen to it for yourself to find out how great it is. So yeah, Brave New World. Also kind of underrated to an extent. Not too much though, but yeah, great album. Okay, so next up we are are we in the top 5? Yeah, I think we're in the top 5, guys. So yeah, I mean, from this point on, you're just going to get solid material from Iron Maiden. But yeah, this is where things kind of do get tough too, because, I mean, boy, from this point on, you're just getting awesome material from Iron Maiden. Now, some people might have this next album in the top 3. For me personally, it doesn't deserve to be in the top 3. I think this album is just a pinch overrated, but that's not saying much because I still think it's a really great album. But next up, we got The Number of the Beast, and I mean, what can I say about it? I mean, it's a great album, and it's, of course, a classic. It's also Iron Maiden's biggest album. This was their most successful album. I mean, what can I say about it? It has a lot of great songs on it, like The Prisoner and Run to the Hills, which are probably my top 2 on this album. But yeah, definitely a great album. So yeah, that's all I can really say about it. It's a classic. So Number of the Beast, it's a really good album. Okay, so next up, now some people might disagree with this album being above Number of the Beast and maybe even above Killers and the debut album, but who knows. Next up, we got Peace of Mind. I mean, this album is just, well, it's a fantastic album. I mean, what can I say about it? I mean, it's a classic. It has some of Maiden's best songs on it. Where Eagles Dare, Revelations, and The Trooper, of course. I mean, The Trooper has, every Maiden fan should know this song. It's a classic. But yeah, definitely a great album. I know some people might disagree with this being at number 4 in my ranking, but hey, this is my ranking. It's my opinion. Whatever. But yeah, I do like this album a lot. So, Peace of Mind, it's a classic. Can't go wrong with it. So now we are in the top 3. Now, from this point on, you guys probably already know, what my top 3 are. But yeah, next up, we got Somewhere in Time. And, I mean, whenever I first got into Maiden, which was back in late 2016, which I know is really late when it comes to getting into Iron Maiden. But whenever I did get into them, I remember being very drawn to this album. This was like, this has just always been one of my favorite Iron Maiden albums. I mean, this album is really fantastic. I mean, it has a lot of great songs on it, like Caught Somewhere in Time, Sea of Madness, Stranger in a Strange Land. I mean, really great Iron Maiden songs. But yeah, definitely one of their most 80s sounding albums too. And this is kind of where the band kind of used synths more. And I think it went off really well. I think they know this album is just a very atmospheric album. But I think they did it in a really good way. But yeah, Somewhere in Time, it's a great album. Not much to say about it. So next up, we are in the top 2. Now, at number 2, this used to be my number 1, but my number 1 has kind of changed throughout time. But this album is still fantastic. I still consider it a near 10 out of 10 album. I mean, it's still a great album. This is definitely an album you gotta have somewhere in the top 3 of Iron Maiden's best albums. But yeah. Next up, at number 2, we got Power Slave. Now, this was actually my first Iron Maiden album. This was one of the albums that really helped me get into the band. So this album definitely has a special place for me personally. It has a lot of great songs on it, though, such as Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, Flash of the Blade, and the title track. I mean, just really solid tracks, but yeah, just awesome album right here. So, Power Slave, definitely a great album. So now we are here at number 1. Now you guys know at this point what number 1 is. It is the band's concept album, and I know there's a lot of people that would have this at number 1, and for good reason too. This album, in my opinion, has no bad songs on it. They're all great songs, and the album I got at number 1, what I think is the best Iron Maiden album, is Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And what can I say about this album that hasn't already been said? This album is fantastic. I mean, every song on here is great. I mean, but if I had to pick out some favorites, I mean, Infinite Dreams, Can I Play with Madness, and Evil That Men Do. I mean, I can go on about every song on this album, but man, this album is just, it's fantastic. I'd pretty much recommend anyone checking it out, especially if you love heavy metal. I mean, definitely give the album a listen. But yeah, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, definitely a fantastic album, and it's my number 1. So there you go, guys. That is my ranking of the Iron Maiden discography. Let me know how you guys would rank this band's discography, and let me know what you guys think of my ranking. So with that being said, thanks for watching, have a nice day, and take care.